Lights and Southern Sun, Sustainable De-risking and a New North-South Partnership. Let me invite the panelists this morning. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Denmark, the Permanent Secretary of State from Iceland, Børge Brende, President of the World Economic Forum, Professor Umu Salma Baba from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and they'll be moderated by Radhika Kapoor, Professor at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming them.
Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this discussion on Northern Lights and Southern Sun, sustainable de-risking, and the new North-South partnership. Let me begin by first thanking the organizers for putting together this rather creatively titled session, and of course, bringing together the key actors in this conversation on this platform today. Now, as the parameters of Europe's economic relationship with China continue to be debated and tested, de-risking has emerged as the preferred approach to decoupling, which entails a complete disentanglement and threatens immense toil for the economies involved. De-risking assumes great urgency for the EU, as the EU is heavily reliant on China, particularly for rare earth elements that it requires so vitally for not just its green transition, but also for its digital transformation. 98% of EU's demand for rare earth elements is met by China. Now, in an attempt to reduce its reliance on China, especially for decarbonization, EU has adopted policies such as the Critical Raw Materials Act and the Net Zero Industrial Act. However, there are concerns about whether these policies alone will substantially reduce the many critical dependencies along the supply chain. What makes matters particularly tricky is that the US's response to its reliance on China has entailed industrial policies which involve huge subsidies that have led to the reshoring of production of renewables. In fact, it has also diverted some green tech resources from the EU. Now, the EU perhaps does not have the fiscal space to re-subsidize its industrialization in the manner that the United States can. And so, therefore, as it continues its search for diversification of critical raw materials, it will not only need to undertake more concrete actions, but also look for many new partnerships. And that's the context of this discussion today. This panel will, of course, bring together perspectives from Europe, in particular the Nordic and Baltic countries, on what are the opportunities and challenges for such a partnership between the Northern Lights and the Southern Sun, which emerge as these countries craft their de-risking policy. Now, of course, before we start this conversation around the partnerships, I think it's important to understand a little bit about what de-risking entails. Because while we all might agree on the need for de-risking, there is a whole spectrum of views in the EU around de-risking. What does it entail? What is the vision? What is the scope of de-risking? And for some countries, it's geopolitical factors that are driving de-risking, and for others, it's economic factors. So let me first start by bringing together, start the conversation by understanding what de-risking entails. And so I'd request the panelists to briefly tell me what this entails for their country, and I want to start with Lithuania. Minister Landsbergis, you've been at the forefront of this conversation on de-risking, if I may say that. You have borne the brunt of punitive trade measures from China. There were export restrictions on Lithuania. How do you envision de-risking for your country, and what does it really entail?
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here and kick off the panel. I'd start not from de-risking from China, but de-risking from another country. Or decoupling from another country, which is even geographically closer to us, it's Russia. Europe has sleepwalked into the dependency on Russian natural resources to such level that when the crisis started, we had to decouple basically in months, with enormously high cost. And I think that that gave a very belated but an alarm awakening bell that we cannot afford this sort of mistake for the second time. We cannot have a dependence like this on anything that we import. And Lithuania was in the forefront of the first dependency as well, since in 2008 Lithuania has been paying the highest price in Europe for natural gas, because we had a sole supplier for it. We had one pipeline, one supplier, and the highest price. And since 2012, we decided, actually a bit earlier, since 2010, and then in 2012, we opened a first LNG terminal in the region. That was the first step towards a de-risking from Russia. The same policy, the same idea we applied when it comes to China. We've seen the dependency on our imports growing, same way that it grows in the whole continent of Europe. And we figured that, look, we cannot afford this. We have to de-risk. We have to find other partners when it comes to imports. We have to find other partners when it comes to investment into especially vulnerable areas in our country. And we have to find new trade partners and quite a wider variety of partners when it comes to our exports. So that was the onset of how we set out to our journey. And yes, one example, when China applied a very strict measures, or trade measures, or restrictions on Lithuanian trade when it comes to China, because they didn't like our foreign policy decisions, it showed why we were right in the first place. Why do you need diversification? Why do you need de-risking? Because a time might come when your dependency actually is turned or weaponized against you. And it's extremely harmful to any country. So we survived, we're fine, but we have a story to tell, and we hope that others might take a lesson in it.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Denmark. Minister, what does de-risking entail for you? In October last year, the Prime Minister of Denmark went to Japan, and she said, to the effect that we have been too naive when it comes to being dependent, and we need a de-risking strategy. What does that de-risking mean for Denmark?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel discussion. I'm very much in line with Gabriello's. Our situation is slightly different, even though we're a small country. I think we started de-risking without really knowing that we were de-risking back in the 70s, because we were very hit by the oil crisis. We were too dependent on fossil fuels from the OPEC countries. And that started the Danish wind adventure, which actually brought us in a totally different situation than Lithuania and Europe in general. I mean, basically it's about not being too dependent on anyone. But I also want to warn all of us that we shouldn't be so afraid for things happening globally now that we bring ourselves in the opposite corner. I mean, the Danish history is a history about a small country have gained all our prosperity from interaction with the rest of the world, and that goes way back to the Vikings. We have no natural resources, so we have gained all our prosperity from trading with the rest of the world. Among them, China. We have a surplus in our trade relation with China, rather different from many other European countries. So I think, of course, we should de-risk, but we shouldn't decouple, and we should spend more time generally at the global scene discussing what is the precondition for upholding free trade in the world. And that is a huge agenda about the international financial system, about the WTO, about Europe sticking together and holding together, because we have had a tendency, perhaps in the past, to act as individual countries instead of using the force of joining as an alliance. And I think that should be my contribution to the start of this discussion.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Iceland. Secretary Eyjólfsson, what are the stakes for Iceland in this de-risking conversation? And when I ask you that question, one is also mindful of the fact that China actually has a huge interest in Iceland because of its know-how in geothermal energy, and in fact is looking at Iceland for enabling this geothermal transition to reduce some of its dependence on coal. How do you position Iceland in the de-risking conversation?
Thank you. I can, since Lars said he was from a small country, I can say I'm from an even smaller country. And we have always been very aware of de-risking unknowingly or knowingly, as Lars put it. And we started also, since you mentioned the geothermal de-risking in the 70s, or we started earlier actually, but during the oil crisis, we started utilizing geothermal energy at a greater scale than before, and we have been working with China on geothermal for more than 2 decades. And actually the carbon footprint they now are saving in China is more, because of geothermal, is more than Iceland's coal or carbon footprint. And China is we have a free trade agreement with China, one of few European countries as well. So we trade with them. They are not one of our biggest trading partners, but an important one as well. But we also tread this path carefully. We have not joined the Belt and Road Initiative like some have done. We have also had requests for investments. Some 12, 13 years ago, there was a request and an offer to buy 0.4% of the landmass of Iceland, 4,000 square kilometers out of 100,000 from China. That was rejected at that time. So, but it's not only de-risking as Lars mentioned, it's de-risking generally. It's just the principle not to have all your eggs in the same baskets, and be it China or whomever, it's just not wise. And so just by diversifying our economy, having FTAs with a lot of partners, we are part of EFTA. 80% of our free trade, our trade is covered by the free trade agreement, and I will come later back to our FTA with India, but we concluded negotiations just days ago after 17 years and 20 plus rounds, and we hope to be able to sign it in 10 days' time here in Delhi, so I will be back.
Thank you. Let me turn now to you, Mr. Brende. We've heard these different perspectives on de-risking, and of course, across Europe, if you bring in Western Europe, there's a different understanding of what that de-risking entails and who's going to be taking the lead in that. But apart from the capaciousness of the term de-risking itself, there is a bigger challenge of actually the uneven and difficult implementation of de-risking. Because the fact is that China is a very large economy. It developed its competitive advantage in strategic rare earth elements 3 decades ago, and it is not something which can be overcome in 5 to 6 years. Also, the Chinese state has given huge subsidies to the domestic industry, which has helped it to enhance its manufacturing capacity, and especially in the context of clean tech industries. If Europe or the world in general were to also try to reduce its reliance on Chinese supplies, not only would that slow the green transition, but also potentially increase the costs of that transition as well. So there is the economic cost to that de-risking as well. And one then fears that is it possible that a business-first approach in a scenario like this can actually ambush EU policymakers into the sort of energy dependence that we saw 2 years ago in the context of Russia?
Thank you very much, and thank you for that very precise question. we should not forget that there are risks with going too far when it comes to de-risking too. So the growth this year is expected globally to be around 3%. The trend growth for the last 2 decades has been 3.8. So we're lagging behind. And the strategy that we have followed for decades to use the comparative advantages in the economies has led to a tripling of the global GDP since 1990. And the engine behind this growth has been trade. So when trade now is growing slower than the global growth, then we are in a new situation. But when it comes to trade, one also has to use common sense. And for some years, maybe common sense wasn't that common, in the sense that, of course, as my Icelandic colleague was saying, you should not put all your eggs in one basket. And this notion of there is just in time, we saw during COVID is not sufficient as a strategy. Also, you have to have a strategy about just in case. But you have to balance this very, very carefully, as you're also alluding to in your question. A total disintegration of the global economy, of course, would come with a huge cost. Maybe 10% of the global GDP. That would be worse than a depression. But there will be adjustments. Of course, you don't want to have 90% of the semiconductors from one factory or one country, all the antibiotics from one place, or other products. But I think we should continue on a path forward where we buy input factors where it is the cheapest, factoring in that you have to diversify. That will also mean that you're more competitive when you sell what you produce with those input factors. So I don't think we should lose the baby with the bathwater, but some small adjustments is needed. But we also need to have a trade recovery if we want a global economic recovery. There will be no global economic recovery without the trade and investment recovery. So here we have to follow a very balanced approach. But as also you mentioned, another additional factor here is the industry policy. So there is now a renaissance for what we then left decades ago is the industry policy. You tax people, take part of what you then bring in taxes and use them on areas where you think there will be growth in the future. So hopefully those leaders that then do tax people and put it into areas where they think there will be growth, they're right. That hasn't always been the case in the past. So the jury is out if these kind of industry policies really, really will work. You know, if you put 5 economists in a room, there's 8 different opinions. But I think over time, there is partly consensus that you should look at the general conditions for industries, and then you leave it to the entrepreneurs and those that do know how to run businesses to run it and invest where they think the money over time will be giving the best return.
Thank you, and thank you for that cautionary note on the fact that there is a risk of going too far on de-risking. And of course, nevertheless, as you de-risk, you know, Professor Bava, what we've heard on this panel is that Europe has put all its eggs in the China basket when it comes to Asia, and there is a need to look for new allies. And India, of course, is a natural ally in that conversation. And in that context, there has been this discussion around the rediscovery of India, and we heard about it yesterday as well. Now, you have studied India-Europe relations in a changing world. How do you think the contours of that relationship have changed in the context of the green transition in Europe? And if I can add another mix to that dynamic, the fact is that today India is a rising economic power which is far more globally assertive than it ever was. How does that also change the relationship between Europe and India?
Thank you so much, Radhika, and good morning, everyone. Let me contextualize that question. I think we have to go back to a line, two beautiful words which encompass Indian philosophy and which will set the scene for a new partnership between India and Europe. And those two words are Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is one family. Vasudha is Sanskrit for the earth. There is only one earth, there is only one sky, and there is only one global population, even if it's a northern light and a southern sun. And I think we have to recognize that we are intertwined, whether we like it or not. So to take your question on the issue of how has India-Europe changed with this green transition and de-risking, I think there's a political element to de-risking, and then there is the economic reality of not being able to walk away. That means you can't decouple. What post-90 has happened is that we have become far more interdependent, and if you take a political decision, as crises will do and push, and has happened in the case of Europe, to turn away from Russia in terms of energy supplies, and then more so bring that same operating philosophy into the area of trade with China, you have to go beyond what I would call as just framing it as a normative understanding. And if you look at India and Europe as natural partners and allies, India should be your first choice. I would not say the only choice. I would not be so greedy to say that. I think we have a little work to do on our end. But I think let's recognize that perhaps this cannot just be about political choices for economic necessity. This has to be a human choice about developing different alternatives for tomorrow. We can't be short-term for a few years and then live with consequences of political decisions which will produce effects which does not allow you to even de-risk and walk away. And business is invested in much longer cycles of 30 to 40 years, as everybody knows about it. Political decisions are for the short term till the next election cycle. And as we get into the year of the mother of all elections, that politics will guide a lot of decision. I think fundamentally three things are happening. First, on the India-EU front, I would say that there's a lot of positive sign on concluding the free trade agreement and the investment with the FTA. It's going through, and that's happening. Second, I would think that the collective wisdom at the high table, is recognizing the need for a partnership which puts the interest of the planet first and the interest of the state a little after that. There is only one ship on which we're all bound. If it goes down, we're all going down. I think that essence has to be transmitted, and the green transition becomes extremely important in terms of the decision in Europe, but also linking up to because half the planet's population is in this part of the world. You can't have a clear blue sky in the north if the south is not able to breathe easy. And I think that's extremely important to think, how do we link up with technology, sustainable financing, to make de-risking not in a sense just another word, which is the buzz of the season, but technically that which goes into moving words into action. And if you're able to reach our SDG goals, I think we would have taken a step in the right direction. So I think that's extremely important in what is happening. And in terms of the larger political dimension, I think we're at a good point to see how, in terms of the development, there is a new recognition, I think, on both the European side and on the Indian side, in making each other the partner of choice, in the current context. And in the way the current politics and the increasing, new conflict and contestations have perhaps, in that sense, done a favor to both sides to revisit the way we reposition ourselves, not just as another strategic partner. I mean, India has more than 30, but I think to make it the most strategic partner, and I think that is where we will have to do a little bit more work to take the conversation forward.
Thank you. So, of course, there's a lot of interest in the partnership with India, but when we're talking about the global south and de-risking, I think another important actor in this conversation is also Central Asia. Central Asia, with its supply of rare earth elements, can also potentially break China's monopoly, and there's a scope for building a partnership there as well. So I'd now like to turn to understanding, especially the Nordic and Baltic perspective, on increasing engagement not just with India, but also with Central Asia, to have greater collaboration, be it on rare earths or emerging technologies. And let me start with Denmark here, because the Green Energy Strategic Partnership already provides a framework for that cooperation with India. But how do you see Denmark's engagement more broadly with the global south? And perhaps if you could also say something in the context of the Nordic countries, what that partnership, the new North-South partnership entails for the Nordics.
Sorry. First of all, I would like to say that I'm totally in line with the REF president when he said that there's also a risk if we de-risk too much. And there's also a risk if we generalize too much and put, different countries in the same basket. I hate that impression, the global south. What is the global south? In Denmark right now, we started to discuss a comprehensive strategic plan towards Africa. It surprised me that many Danes, even in our industrial environment, look at Africa as Africa. I mean, when the reality is that it's 54 different countries with totally different circumstances linked to them in terms of democracy, development, access to raw materials, etc. So I think the most important thing is to have if we want to diversify, we also have to have a nuanced look at the rest of the world. That's my perspective. And talking about the Nordics, I mean, we have so many things in common. We are here as a joint delegation from the Nordic and Baltic countries. If we link our economies together, we would be a G10 country. And we could play a bigger role if we step up together. And that is at least the way I like to think on the challenges. And that's why we also have engaged with India with this Green Strategic Partnership, because we like to think of ourselves as someone who have certain skills, and India has the scale. So that's a match made in heaven, so to speak. And I can see when I look at the figures that we make a difference in Denmark and India. Just one example, the company Danfoss has invested like 300 billion euro in India, are going to triple that in the next decade. So I think that's the way forward, to engage with like-minded countries and to combine competitive advantages and not being too dependent on a one-way trade relation. We know for a fact that the global demand for lithium is expected to increase up to 5-fold in 2030, and rare earth elements used in magnets for electric vehicles and wind turbines may increase by 6 to 7-fold by 2050. And for that reason, we need to create alliances, and that's what we are working hard on in Europe. I mentioned that briefly in my first remarks, that perhaps there have been a tendency to that the 27 European countries have acted alone, also towards China. And if we join forces, I mean, and that's what we're working on with these alliances, we could make a huge difference.
Thank you. Minister Landesbergis, the Baltics have emerged as an area of strategic interest for India. How do you see this North-South partnership, and who would be the key actors for you in this partnership?
One has to one has to say that there is a reason why you would see so many European delegations here in New Delhi today. Apparently, it is quite obvious where do European countries see strategic direction, where to. But definitely doesn't stop there. As my colleagues have mentioned, ASEAN countries have so much to offer. And the partnerships that we already had with countries in the past, such as Australia or Japan, South Korea, which are being rekindled right now as well. So we're seeing, much wider approach, a global approach from Europe than ever before. But it also, I would like to stress one additional thing, is that, we're talking about the approach from the governments, what national governments or what the European Commission can do to encourage diversification, to encourage this broader approach. But there's also an element where businesses do what businesses do. It's up to them to decide where do they want to invest, where they want to, who do they want to have partnerships with. And it's mostly about the bottom line. It was always about the bottom line. Where it's cheapest, where it's the most convenient, where it doesn't hurt or it does help the bottom line. But what we see now is that there are additional factors that do affect this bottom line. And they are more of a, I would call, metaphysical nature when we talk about values, such as rule of law. If we want to invest, if a company wants to invest or have a long-term partnership, be it with trade or imports or exports or investment, whatever, they need to know where does the government stand. Because we've seen in the past where things do not go well because the governments do make political decisions when it comes to trade. They limit the abilities of companies, they hurt the companies, and they hurt the bottom line. So it's also, we have to take this into consideration because we're seeing, some of the countries have falling investment rates. Not because the government or Madam von der Leyen said, that you shouldn't invest there. Because nobody would say this, but the companies are choosing because they don't believe that this country is headed, in the best of directions for their bottom line. So I think that, going back to your question, Nordics and Baltics, we're quite pragmatic people in most of the cases. So I think that many companies are actually checking what is most profitable for them.
Right. So actually, that's a very important point. If I can bring in Mr. Brende in on this. When companies make these decisions to invest, it is driven by the bottom line. And of course, there are a whole host of structural factors which impact that bottom line in many countries in the global south. So what do you think it would really take to scale up investment in the global south?
So let's use India as an example. India is today around $3 trillion US economy. And I'm very bullish on growth in India moving forward. I think in a decade, a $10 trillion US economy. And why is that? One of the reasons is that India is now well positioned where we see increasing growth when it comes to digital trade and services. So digital trade is today 15% of the global trade, but is growing double as fast as traditional goods. The same is for services. So with 1.4 billion people with a digital identity, it gives good positioning in what we're now facing, new situation when it comes to technology and opportunities. And I think this can also be a learning for other developing countries, that you have to have the right skills. You also have to look at, of course, predictability, red tape, and making sure that it is attractive to invest also as a foreigner. So, of course, India is also, coming back to the main topic about de-risking, India has also been, is in a fortunate position that it's benefiting from this friendshoring. So, 5 years ago, none of these iPhones were produced in India. Today, 25% are produced in this country. So India is benefiting also from the de-risking, provided that the de-risking doesn't go so far that it has too much of a negative impact on the global growth, as I was mentioning. And the system that we had in the past with the comparative advantages, we should not underestimate it also in the North-South context, because since 1990, we've moved from 42% of the global population living in extreme poverty to 12% today. That's just incredible, and we added 2 billion people on top of it. So that success kind of scheme where trade was at the basis of it, we also have to continue on that path. But of course, we have to factor in some of the things that were mentioned with diversification and level playing field. And that was one of your first questions or premises. Of course, if you compete, you should compete on the same terms. And there you come into areas like state subsidies and also industrial policies. So the anti-dumping measures, I think we have to be very conscious about also moving forward.
Right, thank you. And I want to build on this trade question, and here I'd like to turn to Iceland. Secretary, you mentioned that India is now close to closing the trade agreement with the EFTA. Other than the trade aspect, what are the other dimensions in which you think Iceland can expand elements of cooperation with the Global South?
Well, yeah, creating a foreseeable legal framework like free trade agreements is, paves the way for investments and cooperation. I mentioned the FTA with India. We also have similar agreements with a lot of countries in Africa as well. And that helps our economic operators to share experiences in the field of geothermal, in the field of fisheries, where we are now utilizing almost 100% of every cod we fish, where we used to throw away 50%, only fillet it, and then throw the rest away some 25 years ago. So this we are sharing. We have 3 billion people having their source of nutrition from the oceans. So there is a lot of engagement there, both for Iceland as such, and also with our Nordic and Baltic partners. And this is what we are doing through our development cooperation, etc. So there is a lot of fields to be covered and activity.
Excellent. So before I open to the panel, open the discussion to the floor, very briefly, Professor Bava, we've heard all of this from the European lens. Let's just flip the prism briefly and hear something about who India sees as potential partners when it's trying to manage and balance its own China strategy, and what should we be doing to strengthen those strategic partnerships?
So we have a range of strategic partnerships, and I think it's very clear that the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater are interconnected. In fact, all theaters are interconnected. So there's, while you manage the economic dimension of your interdependence with China, I think it's also important that India is looking at strengthening the political aspects of its strategic partnerships with Europe. And we have a strong sets of bilaterals over there. Along with the India-EU strategic partnership, we've got strong bilaterals. We've just recently had the Nordic-Baltic Business Council meeting as well with India. And of course, there's the other dimension of the Atlantic of the relationship with the United States. So I think India is looking at, I would hesitate to use the word multi-alignment, but India is very pragmatic at this point in time, to see that if you're looking at diversifying supply chains, preventing the risk and the impact what we've witnessed in the last decade, but more so in the last few years, I think that pragmatism is being met by very strong policy choices from New Delhi, which has definitely put Europe central to its policy of expanding and reducing And so it's a different kind of asset management of your basket of investment portfolio, I would say, in which while, as Børge, you just mentioned, you can't go too fast too soon. There's a fear of taking everything down. So I think while you politically manage some of that, you also enable conditions, and Europe is, I think, the partner of choice for India and will remain.
Right, thank you so much. And we have very little time, but we do want to take some questions from the floor. I'd first like to take, if there are any Raisina young fellows who would like to pose questions, I'd urge you to come forth, please. We'll take just 3, maximum 4 questions and get back to the panel because we're short of time. Yes, please, if you can introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Lovanda Ganamos. I'm a researcher and lecturer about India and Indo-Pacific from Israel. And I would like to know, I believe that India and Pacific region, and especially India, has a crucial role in the world supply chain. But I would like to hear your regional perspective on how you see your role in the near future, and what is the regional vision for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, I can take these 2 questions. The lady in blue.
I'm Kanakvali Suryanarayanan. I'm an advocate and polar law scholar from University of Akureyri, Iceland. My question is to the Minister of Denmark and to the Secretary of Iceland. So the Arctic Council is on a pass, and China is more and more coming into space and looking at the polar Silk Route. And it's completely on a breakdown. The system is on a breakdown there. So how do you see that Iceland and Denmark could continue to, engage with the rest of the world? Because especially with Greenland, you have more and more engagements, diplomatic engagements with China, and also China is looking at investments in minerals. And also in Iceland, Finnaford is, you look at an Arctic hub in the future, and it perfectly aligns with the polar Silk Route of China.
Thank you.
So I would like to hear your words.
Very briefly, if you could just quickly summarize your question in one
Hi, good
line.
morning. I'm Rahul Banerjee. My question is to Minister Rasmussen from Denmark. Minister, Denmark and India remains one of the major partners when it comes to green energy transition, and Denmark remains India's one of the most trusted partners. How do you see this green strategic partnership shaping out in the coming decade, maybe? Thank you.
So I'm going to turn back to the panel. If you'd like to respond to the questions, start with you, Minister Landis-Børge, and we'll go down.
Well, I wouldn't be able to respond to any specific question. I'm just saying that the mood here in the panel is really festive, and from the questions as well. So I believe that we are on a very good track for increased partnership in the future. I'm really glad that this panel was about Nordics and Baltics mostly. So we tend to feel the strategy or strategic approach here. So I'm hoping for the best for the future, and thank you for the questions.
Well, first about the Arctic, I mean, it's no secret that the cooperation in the Arctic is challenged by Russia's unfairful, illegal aggression in Ukraine. They have suspended the payment to the Arctic Council, which is led by Norway. We are going to take up the chairmanship next year, and we are very careful how to conduct this because we want to keep the Arctic as a low tense area. But there's also a lot of possibilities, as the second person asked about, linked to Greenland. Greenland is a part of the Kingdom of Denmark together with Faroe Island, and it's probably complicated to understand from an outsider's perspective, but Denmark is a part of the European Union. Greenland is not a part of the European Union, but we are working hard, they're working hard to have closer ties. The President of the Commission will visit Greenland in a couple of weeks. The European Union are going to open a new representation, a new facility in the capital of Greenland. And Greenland actually have access to many of the rare earth elements we just talked about.
Yes.
It is not easy because there's a lot of environmental questions linked to it as well. It's totally up to the Greenlandic authorities to decide what to do. But what we are trying to do is to create this framework with a closer connection between the European Union and Greenland. And there's a lot of potential linked to that. The final question was about the potential in this green strategic partnership between Denmark and India, and I think it is huge. I had the honor yesterday to attend signing of 4 new agreements between Danish companies and Indian companies, and there's a huge potential. Because, as I said earlier, we like to think of ourselves as someone who has the skills, and India definitely has the scale. Our problem in the long run is that India definitely also have the skills, so we have to keep up in order to be a preferred partner for India in the long run. But that's absolutely our ambition.
Thank you.
Yes,
would you like to take the question in Iceland, Secretary?
Yeah, we got the question on the Arctic, and I concur with what Lars said on the Arctic Council. There are challenges. I wouldn't describe it as the question was, that it is falling apart. That is not the case. We have challenges there. On the engagement with others in Iceland, I described it a little earlier. You know, we of course we are open for cooperation with others, but we also have to tread that path carefully, especially with those with big ambitions. So I think we will manage that as an Arctic state as well as a normal trading partner. One other question, because you asked about the engagement with the Global South, and that is what we do everywhere. And I'm going to Abu Dhabi to the WTO meeting after I've been in Delhi, and we are also always promoting the gender issues and trade and gender, and we have to bring girls and women on board wherever and in whichever context. So, thank you very much for the letting me participate here. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, the red screen in front of me is flashing and telling me the time's up, but this has been a truly fascinating discussion. And like Minister Børge said, I think the environment is very festive, and the conversations on this panel suggest that we are at perhaps a unique inflection point of the relationship between India and Europe, and I hope that we see the strengthening of this strategic partnership in the years to come. So thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you for your comments.
Thank you.